Okay, so let us begin with the first paragraph of the essay, The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. In this first paragraph, Frederick Jameson defines postmodernism as an inverted millenarianism, which is characterized by a belief in the end of all existing uh, ideas, all existing notions about human life and about human society. So he says that the last few years have been marked by an inverted millenarianism, which is a belief about the future. He says there is neither a belief that the future will be very good, nor that the future will be very bad and catastrophic. Rather, this millenarianism is characterized by a belief in the end of so many different phenomena. He lists these phenomena, which, according to him, as far as postmodernism is concerned, seem to have come to an end. End of ideology, end of art, end of social class, end of Leninism, end of social democracy, end of welfare state. And he says that this trend of believing in the end of everything, something he has described as the end of this or that, he says can be traced back to the end of 1950s and early 60s. So this break occurred in 1950s and 1960s. As far as our understanding is concerned, we can, from this statement, we can, we can, based on this statement, we can say that according to Jameson, postmodernism seems to have been inaugurated in the 50s and in the 60s, whatever postmodernism entails, whatever it means. Okay? It is a phenomena which began in the 1950s and 1960s. It's an inverted millenarianism, which is characterized by a belief in the end of all existing phenomena, which have been central to our understanding of the world, the society, our life, and ourselves. In the second paragraph, he goes on to say that at a second level, we can define postmodernism or this break as the warning or extinction of the 100-year-old modern movement. So, in the very next paragraph, Frederick Jameson shows us another way of understanding postmodernism. And he says that postmodernism can also be understood to be the end of the 100-year-old aesthetic movement called modernism, which found expression in art and culture. We can say that according to him, after 50s and 60s, modernism gradually faded away. After reaching its zenith, after reaching its peak in high modernist art, there was a period before the 50s and 60s when high modernism flourished, and some of the tallest practitioners of high modernism produced their works in visual arts, in music, and in other forms of creative experience. As the word itself suggests, the break is most often related to notions of the waning, the or extinction of the 100-year-old modern movement. So, thereafter, he names many important practitioners of high modernism who, according to him, dominated the scene in literature and arts for a very long time before postmodernism, or we can say postmodern aesthetics in art and culture was born. I will just name three. One is Andy Warhol. Sorry, the artists, three figures who he identifies with postmodernism. They are Andy Warhol, who was a leading figure in visual art movement, and his works were characterized by a free mixing up of pure art and commercial art. Second name, which he mentions here, is that of John Cage, who was a highly experimental music composer. And he is known for a non-standard use of musical instruments and challenges some of the basic assumptions related with music, such as that music is synonymous with harmony. He challenges these assumptions. Third is Jean Godard, who's a French filmmaker known for his experimentation with film narrative and with camera work. So in the second paragraph, after saying that postmodernism can also be understood to be the end of modernism, after modernism reached its zenith in high modernism, and he mentions the names of several artists, musicians, filmmakers, painters. I have named just three, but if you read the essay, there is a very long list. So I have named just Andy Warhol, John Cage, and Jean Godard, who, according to him, are exponents of this new kind of experience in arts called postmodernism. Then, in the third paragraph, he says that what we see as postmodernism, or what we understand as postmodernism, is more clearly visible in architecture than as compared to the other arts. And let me tell you right at the outset that most of this essay is an attempt to read postmodernist elements in paintings and in architecture. So this essay is divided into two parts. He takes some works of painting and he takes a few buildings for discussion in order to enumerate the characteristics of postmodernism. So when we come to the third paragraph, he says that the modifications in aesthetic production are more clearly, dramatically visible in architecture. In architecture, according to him, some important and famous architects after during the later half of the 19th, 20th century, began to reassess the works of modern architecture. There is, we can say, a reassessment of architectural high modernism. A very good example of which is the urban planning done by such famous architects as Le Corbusier, who was also the master planner of our own Chandigarh. There was in modern architecture an attempt to redefine city planning, urban planning, and an attempt to overcome the problems of traditional crowded cities and provide better living conditions. There was an effort in high modernism to build new kind of urban spaces, which were very different from the traditional architectural designs, traditional cities. So in the second paragraph, you will find a mention of Le Corbusier. High modernism is thus credited with the destruction of the fabric of the traditional city and its older neighborhood culture, and all the works of high modernism have a very strong relationship with the name of the master. Just as I have said, we identify Chandigarh with the vision, with the creative, intellectual, architectural abilities of Le Corbusier. Then in the fourth paragraph, he says that postmodernism in architecture, after high modernism of such figures as Le Corbusier, we have postmodern architecture of such new architects as Robert Venturi. Postmodernism in architecture will then logically enough stage itself as a kind of aesthetic populism. Now, what is this postmodern architecture? He says it is different. Whereas in modern architecture, there was an attempt, as I have said, to build new cities, new urban spaces with better living conditions, and to conceive of cities which were markedly different from traditional cities. In postmodernism, he says there is an effacement of the older frontier between high culture and so-called mass or commercial culture. This, it seems to be, because there has been a suggestion earlier also of the same thing, this seems to be one of the defining characteristics of what is being described as postmodernism. That in postmodernism, there is an effacement of the older frontier between high culture and what is described as mass culture or commercial culture, and an attempt to take inspiration, clue from almost everything, be it TV series, be it advertising, be it B-grade Hollywood movies, So there is, according to him, there is, when he says there's an effacement of the frontier between high culture and low culture, he means that in postmodernism, the division between the elite high culture, or what we often call pure art, and low culture, commercial culture, pop culture, popular culture, these divisions break down, come to an end. And then in the next paragraph, he says that it will be wrong to delimit our understanding only to some transformation and change which is visible in the field of art and architecture. He says that postmodernism is often linked with the emergence of a new society, which is defined as post-industrial society. Alternatively, it is also described as consumer society, media society, information society, electronic society, or high tech. Such theories have the obvious ideological mission of demonstrating to their own relief that the new social formation in question no longer obeys the laws of classical capitalism, namely the primacy of industrial production and the omnipresence of. And then he goes on to mention the name of Ernest Mandel, from whose book, Late Capitalism, he has borrowed this term. And he says that according to one opinion, there is a restructuring of the society at the root of these changes. But there are people who may disagree with this also, that the society or the capitalist structure of society has remained the same, even though some social changes may have become very common. हाँ जी, so मैं पहले 6 पैराग्राफ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਸਮਰਾਈਜ਼ ਕਰਤੇ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਗਰੁੱਪ 'ਚ ਅੱਜ ਹੀ ਸ਼ੇਅਰ ਕਰਦਾ। Just a second. अच्छा, ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਜੋ ਕਹਿ ਰਿਹਾ ਉਹ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਕੋਈ ਬਹੁਤ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਿਲ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ I am speaking Greek? ਥੋੜਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਤਾਂ ਸਮਝ ਆ ਗਿਆ ਹੋਣਾ ਇਦਾਂ ਸੁਣ ਕੇ ਵੀ। ਹਾਂਜੀ, ਕਿ ਬਿਲकुल नहीं, रिकॉर्डिंग सुन के ही पता लगेगा? Yes? Nobody? Yes, Swati?
यस सर।
थोड़ा बहुत पता लग गया?
सर अभी मैंने ऐसे भी नहीं पढ़ा तो ज्यादा तो कुछ पता नहीं था।
चलो, when you relate this with the essay, जब essay पढ़ोगे नाल-नाल सुनोगे ना, फिर थानू थोड़ा-थोड़ा क्लैरिटी होएगी, लेकिन एक बार च नहीं होएगी, कई बार सुनना पड़ेगा।
यस सर।
चलो ठीक है फिर इनू ਆਪਾਂ ਇਹੀ ਐਕਸਰਸਾਈਜ਼ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਮੈਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ 8 ਤੋਂ 10 ਲੈਕਚਰ ਜਾਂ ਮੇਬੀ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਘੱਟ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ we will be able to finish the most important things। ਜੇ ਸਾਰਾ ਐਸੇ ਨਾ ਵੀ ਹੋਇਆ ਤਾਂ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਤੇ ਸਵਾਲ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਆ ਨਾ, ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਕਿ मतलब what postmodernism ਦੀਆਂ characteristics ਕੀ ਹੈ ਨਾ, world of surfaces ਕੀ ਹੈ, ਤੇ ਇਹ ਸਭ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ। simulacra वगैरह, pastiche, ये सारे कुछ आते होंगे सवाल वो आप। So we will meet tomorrow. After the preliminary comments in the opening of postmodernism or the cultural logic of late capitalism, where Jameson reveals his objective and intention of trying to enumerate the characteristic features of postmodernism. He sets out in the first part to define postmodernism, and he, as far as the first part is concerned, he tries to define postmodernism with the help of two works of art. One is Vincent van Gogh. This is the pronunciation. Vincent van Gogh's painting. It's quite a famous painting called Peasant Shoes. Vincent van Gogh was a Dutch painter who lived from 1853 to 1890, and his works are considered to be very important contributions to Western art or to modern art. He experimented with the art of painting, and his paintings are characterized by bold colors, impulsive and expressive brushwork. So Jameson selects Peasant Shoes as the first specimen of art which he attempts to look at, and then compare this work to Andy Warhol's Diamond Dust Shoes in order to show us the differences between modernism and postmodernism. Now, Diamond Dust Shoes is a painting which all of you can easily find on the internet. You can have a look at the painting whenever you like. So, in the first few lines of part one, Jameson begins by saying, "We will begin with one of the canonical works of high modernism in visual art, Van Gogh's well-known painting of Peasant Shoes." And he says that I have chosen this with a great amount of care, that this is not a randomly or a innocently chosen specimen, that this specimen has been chosen very carefully with a deliberate purpose in mind. Now, it is a simple picture of battered shoes belonging to a worker, a peasant who works in the field. But as I have said, because Van Gogh's paintings are characterized by bold colors, okay, impulsive and expressive brushwork, so definitely the shoes, the painting has not been created in a realistic manner, or it does not attempt to resemble the real peasant shoes. There is an element of impressionism, okay, in the painting. So Jameson places this painting for discussion, and he then begins his or he makes some comments on this work. He says that there are two ways of interpreting this painting. Okay? There are two ways of interpreting the whole object world of agricultural misery, a stark rural poverty, and the whole rudimentary human world of back-breaking peasant toil. A world reduced to its most brutal and menaced, primitive and marginalized state. This is the world that the painting refers to. Okay? This painting is a response, according to Jameson. It's a response to the whole object world of agricultural misery. So this forms the subject of this painting. The painting ostensibly intends to draw our attention to the poverty, the misery, the back-breaking toil, okay, which is integral to agricultural life. But as we have already said, the painting is garishly overlaid with hues of red and green. So how do you reconcile the drab, dull, okay, world of agricultural poverty with the choice of garish, gaudy, bright and bold colors in the painting? This work is a work of high modernism. So, and Jameson has already said that there are two ways of interpreting this work. The first interpretive option is that as a work of high modernism, okay, the painting experiments with art and in this way tries to assert the autonomy of the work of art. Okay? This is how he puts it. I will briefly suggest in the first interpretive option that the willed and violent transformation of a drab peasant object. Now, this is the shoes embody the whole rural agricultural world of misery and poverty. They are battered shoes, they are broken and old. So he says the first way of interpreting this work is that there is in this work a willed and violent transformation of a drab peasant object world into the most glorious materialization of pure color in oil paint. So this is according to Jameson, this is a utopian gesture. Okay? How does he call it a utopian gesture? Because it is related with the autonomy of art, the right of art not to replicate the real world, rather the right of art to create its own world based on the materials it uses, based on the techniques available to the artist, based on the materials available to the artist. So there is here a clear rejection of art of realism in art. There is a subversion of realist conventions, and there is an assertion, as I have said, of the autonomy of art to create its own world. So this he describes as utopia or a utopian gesture, an act of compensation which ends up producing a whole new utopian realm of senses, or at least that supreme sense, sight, the visual, the eye, which it now reconstitutes for us as a semi-autonomous space in its own right. So art, the world of art is its own space. It is a work in its own right. Art is not a parasite which lives on the world. Rather, it has its own existence. It can create, recreate, transform reality. Okay? And this is precisely what Van Gogh, a very important exponent of modern art, tries to do. Then, before we come to the second work, which is Andy Warhol's Diamond Dust Shoes, which is an example of postmodern art, he decides to give us a second interpretation of this work of high modernism. Okay, Van Gogh's work is a work of high. For this, he uses or he refers to Martin Heidegger, who's a very important German theorist and philosopher. His work, he refers to his work, The Origin of the Work of Art, where there is some discussion on this, on Hawes painting and peasant shoes. So he refers to Heidegger's work in order to give us the second interpretation, the second possible interpretation, which is built on the Heideggerian or Heidegger's distinction between earth and world, and Heidegger's assertion or Heidegger's belief that of any work of art has to be placed in the dynamics that exists between these two things, the earth and the world. So there is, to be sure, a second reading of Van Gogh, which can hardly be ignored when we gaze at this particular painting. And that is Heidegger's central analysis in The Origin of the Work of Art, where there is some discussion on house painting, and which is organized around the idea that the work of art emerges within the gap between the earth and the. And he, taking his clue from Heidegger, he tries to define Heidegger's ideas of the earth and the world. What are they? Between earth and world, or what I would prefer to translate as the meaningless materiality of the body. So earth is the basic facts of existence. The basic fact of existence is its pointlessness, its materiality, its transience, the consciousness that life ultimately may be absurd and pointless, made up of material aspects, resources. Second is world. What does world refer to? World is the nature and meaning endowment of history and the social. So these can be roughly reformulated as earth is the meaningless materiality of the body, the basic fact that that life has a material basis, and second, that everything is made up of material resources, and on the second hand, the world, which can be roughly translated as society and culture, the networks of signification, which determine how we think, how we look at things, how we perceive things. He says it is between the gap, between this gap between earth and the world, that any work of art should be placed, interpreted. So, going ahead, he simply says that whereas the work Peasant Shoes does invoke in our minds the realities of the agricultural world, which are a part of our social experience, they also draw attention to two more things. What are they? The materiality of the rural life. Second, the materiality of the shoes. Three, the materiality of the work of art. Because normally this paradigm differs from the conventional paradigms because normally a work of art never foregrounds the fact that it is also made up of it also has a material existence, that there are materials which are used. So when you highlight foreground, when you emphasize the instruments with which you work, like paint, you're also somewhere trying to bring out the materiality of art itself. Van Hoss painting is the disclosure of what the equipment, the pair of shoes, is in truth. The entity emerges into the unconcealment of things. Heidegger's account needs to be completed by insistence on the renewed materiality of the work, on the transformation of one form of materiality, the earth itself and its parts and physical objects, into that other materiality of oil paint, affirmed and foregrounded in its own right and for its own visual pleasures. So it says that the second interpretation is that the work, while resonating with our social sense of the agricultural world, also unconceals some of the material aspects. The silent call of the earth, its quiet gift of ripening corn, enigmatic self-refusal in the fallow desolation of the wintry field. It also foregrounds the materiality of the work of art. It's the work of art's ability, its autonomy, its ability to create, recreate, transform, and give rise to a new world. But this section ends with a very, very important, from where I think his definitions of postmodernism will arise. At any rate, both readings may be described as hermeneutical. Hermeneutics is the science of interpretation, textual interpretation. He says, whether we take the first interpretation or we take the second interpretation, in both, hermeneutics is involved. We are trying to find and discover the meaning of this text. Okay, so we saw that in the previous discussion, in the first section, Jameson takes up Van Hoss painting Peasant Shoes as an example of high modernism and makes some very important comments about this painting and the 3 or 4 different ways in which this painting can be interpreted. Now, before coming to the second work which he cites as an example to enumerate the characteristic features of postmodernism, he goes on to say that at any rate, both readings may be described as hermeneutical in the sense in which the work in its inert, objectal form is taken as a clue or a symptom of some vaster reality which replaces it. So, howsoever you interpret Van Gogh's peasant shoes, okay, whether you look at it as a form of experimentation in art, where the autonomy of art is asserted through stylistic experimentation or innovation, or you borrow the Heideggerian model to uh, understand the meaning of Van Gogh's peasant shoes. Okay? It upholds hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the science of interpretation of texts. So we can say that in both the ways of interpreting Van Gogh's painting, interpretation is possible. But the first point he makes when he comes to postmodernism or when he comes to Andy Warhol's Diamond Dust Shoes is that there is a breakdown of hermeneutics in postmodernism. That means the works of art in their in their most important uh, in their most important constitutive element become impossible to interpret. There is a breakdown of hermeneutics, which means all the models of interpretation, all the models of hermeneutics fail to unearth, discover any meaning in these texts. So we can put the same thing as that these texts defy meaningfulness. They do not render themselves easily to interpretation. There is a resistance to uh, an interpretation. There is a resistance to any, any uh, understanding or any conceptualization of meaning. This is what he means. And it is very significant that he introduces Andy Warhol's Diamond Dust Shoes with this statement. It's very interesting the way he introduces this set of paintings by Andy Warhol, which you can easily find on the net. It's a series of images with glittery shoes resembling less art and more advertisement. So now we need to look at some shoes of a different kind. And it is pleasant to be able to draw for such an image on the recent work of the central figure of contemporary visual art, Andy Warhol's Diamond Dust Shoes, evidently no longer speak to us with any of the immediacy of Van Gogh's footwear. Indeed, I am tempted to say that it does not speak to us at all. Then we compare Andy Warhol's Diamond Dust Shoes to Van Gogh's peasant shoes. One difference that strikes us is that whereas Van Gogh's peasant shoes lend themselves to interpretation, these shoes do not lend them to interpretation. They seem not to mean anything. And this is what he means. And he says that it seems the, uh, Diamond Dust Shoes evidently no longer speaks to us with any of the immediacy. Second thing is that these paintings of Diamond Dust Shoes do not have any commensal connection, any relationship with the vaster reality. Van Gogh's painting depicted the realities of the agricultural world. They were suggestive of the vaster realities of the agricultural world. Here, there is no context. Okay? The only context which may come to your mind on looking at these shoes is as if the shoes have been left behind after a fire broke out in a dance hall. This is a this is a suggestion which may occur in your mind, but in the normal ways of understanding, these shoes do not mean anything, do not lend themselves to interpretation, and thirdly, they cannot be placed in a in the context of a vaster reality as Van Hor's shoes could be. He takes this comparison between Van Gogh and Andy Warhol further in this section, but his main objective is to explore the meaning of postmodernism through Andy Warhol. Because Andy Warhol began his artistic career as a commercial illustrator for shoe fashions and a designer of display windows in which various pumps and slippers figured prominently. And then he says that Andy Warhol's work approximates fetish, not art. It comes closer, more close to fetish. Fetish is an obsession or a fascination for one or the other object due to certain fixation of mind. It says here there is less of an artistic content in his paintings and more of a fetish-like, more of a fetish-like feeling. You feel as if there is a shoe fetish at play. The way he makes his shoes, the way he presents them. And then Andy Warhol's work, in fact, turns centrally around commodification. It is something akin to something like the big billboard images of Coca-Cola bottle or Campbell soup can, which explicitly foreground the commodity fetishism of a transition to late capitalism. So again, he links this kind of shift in the production of art to consumerism and to some transitions that have taken place as part of the progress of classical capitalism to late capitalism, modern day capitalism, when industrial production does not or is not determined solely by demand, but it becomes a self-actuated process where it is carried on at a frenzied pace without being determined by the realities of demand, okay? Creating a consumerist society based on advertisements. Okay? So then we come to a very, very important point. I will just briefly, because I have these points written here before me, I will just recapitulate and summarize the things we have discussed till now. Van Gogh's peasant shoes stand for some vaster reality. They have a connection. They can be placed in a context which we have experienced in real life. So the relationship between real life and art is maintained. Andy Warhol shoes
do not speak at all. On the level of content, we have to do with not art but fetish in Andy Warhol. Art approximates fetish. Then they do not, Andy Warhol shoes do not have any relationship with the context or the past life, either of the writer or of the human subject or of human beings. Then he links the emergence of postmodern art with commodity fetishism, consumerism, or a transition to late capitalism. Then, after this, he begins to list the characteristic features of postmodernism, the first of which is the first and the most evident is the emergence of a new kind of flatness or depthlessness in a new kind of superficiality in the most literal sense. Perhaps the supreme formal feature of all postmodernisms to which we have occasion to return is a number of other in a number of this is the supreme feature of all postmodernisms that they are characterized by a flatness, a depthlessness. They are a domain of surfaces and surfaces only. In the subsequent paragraph, it says that Andy Warhol makes use of the photographic negative also as if to give us a suggestion of deathly quality of the image. But again, he says that this concern with death is not an existential concern. It is not something that reminds you of some death anxiety or death obsession, as you may have observed in the case of many earlier writers. So there is no serious concern with, serious existential concern with death. Rather, even death is treated here very plainly. Death is treated here very. Although this kind of death of the world of experiences becomes thematized in certain of Warhol's pieces, yes, I think a matter of content any longer. It is not a matter of content any longer, but of some more fundamental mutation, both in the object world itself and in the disposition of the subject. Now become a set of texts or simulacra. This is the second term. After saying that postmodernism can be identified with depthlessness, with a world of surfaces, okay, with a flatness, now he equates it with simulacra. Simulacra is a copy, but more precisely, it is an imperfect. So here, art is an imitation not of life, but it is an imitation of imitation. So there is a subversion of correspondence theory, which upholds a very deep connection between art and life. That seems to become irrelevant now, and now art is to be conceptualized as a copy of a copy, a copy of a copy, imitation of an imitation. All of which brings me to a third feature to be developed here. And I will call this what I will call the waning of effect in postmodern culture. This is the third feature. This is the third feature, the waning of effect in postmodern. If we, before reading, if we just speak about it in a nutshell, waning of effect is a rejection of depth models of various kinds, the models of interpretation which have come to us through various traditions of reading literature. So there is a waning of effect, and the effect that remains is merely an effect of decorative exhilaration or euphoria. Later on, he uses the term gratuitous frivolity. Art is now not an attempt either to seriously understand life, to engage with some existential questions of life. Rather, it is equated with, with gratuitous frivolity. Okay? All of which brings me to a third feature to be developed here, what I will call the waning of effect in postmodern culture. Of course, it would be inaccurate to suggest that all affect, all feeling or emotion, all subjectivity has vanished from the new image. Indeed, there is a kind of return of the repressed in Diamond Rush, the strange compensatory decorative exhilaration, explicitly designated by the title itself, which is, of course, the glitter of gold. So he says that when we look at these paintings created by Andy Warhol, okay, uh, it, it seems to us that all feeling, all emotion, all subjectivity has vanished and has been replaced by a decorative exhilaration. Something we can describe either as euphoria or as, uh, using Frederick Jameson's term, gratuitous frivolity. And he says that the same kind of elements can be traced in Andy Warhol's human subjects also. The waning of effect is, however, perhaps best initially approached by way of the human figure. And it is obvious that what we have said about the commodification of objects holds as strongly for Warhol's human subjects. Warhol made paintings of Marilyn Monroe, who were icons in the 50s and 60s. But they were more famous for their association with some self-destructive habits. And then he draws another comparison. This time with Edward Munch's painting The Scream. The painting The Scream is there on the cover of this book also. This is, he says that we can very profitably compare Edward Munch's very famous work of high modernism called The Scream with Andy Warhol's Diamond Dust Shoes, just as we have compared Diamond Dust Shoes with Van Gogh, in order to better understand the difference between modernism and postmodernism. Edward Munch's painting The Scream is, of course, a canonical expression of the great modernist thematics of alienation, enemy, solitude, social fragmentation, and isolation. A virtual problematic emblem of what used to be called the age of anxiety. So Munch's work, Scream, this work, created a lot of excitement in the world of art because this was a new way of giving expression to the modern problems such as alienation, solitude, fragmentation, isolation, and even the problem that literature or the conventional forms of literature were not adequate to represent the, the anxieties of human beings. So this work is, is in equal measure an expression of human anxiety, alienation, fragmentation, isolation, as much as it is an expression of the disillusionment with conventional art, with the inadequacies of conventional art as an institution, and the need to find new ways of expression, which are far removed from realism or the realist modes of. It will here be read as an embodiment not merely of the expression of that kind of effect, but even more as a virtual deconstruction of the very aesthetic of expression itself, which seems to have dominated much of what we call high modernism, but to have vanished away in the world of postmodernism. Now, all this is absent when we come to postmodernism. Postmodernism does not make any serious attempt to give expression to existential issues, to human isolation, to human alienation, even to the inadequacies of, even to the problem of the inadequacies of art. And everything, as we say, has been replaced by a gratuitous frivolity, a world of surfaces, a decorative exhilaration. There is a short paragraph in which Fredric Jameson suggests that the same trends are to be found in theory also today. Because all the depth models are being subverted. The dialectical one of a sense and appearance, the Freudian model of interpretation of latent and manifest, the existential model of authenticity and inauthenticity, and the semiotic model, which is built on the opposition between the signifier and the signified. Is all these depth models and the earlier model, which Roland Barthes contests in Death of the Author, that there is an underlying meaning which can be captured by recourse to the intention of the author. All these models of interpretation are now losing relevance in theory. And what replaces these depth models is, for the most part, a conception of practices, discourses, textual play, whose new syntagmatic structures we will examine later on. Let it suffice now to observe that here too depth is replaced by surfaces. It says in theory too, there is a tendency towards replacing depth with surfaces. All of which suggests some more general historical hypothesis, namely that concepts such as anxiety and alienation and the experiences to which they correspond as in the are no longer appropriate in the world of postmodern. This shift in the dynamics of cultural pathology can be characterized as one in which the alienation of the subject is displaced by the latter's fragmentation. if depth is replaced by surfaces, art is no more an imitation of reality, but an imitation of imitation, a simulacrum. Then we can say that alienation of the subject has been replaced by a fragmentation of the subject. And lastly, a text, he uses the term intertextuality, that now the only way of understanding and making sense of the works of art is through the notion of intertextuality. And intertextuality is an free interplay of many texts. So when you look at one text, it is not an organic whole. It is a result of a free interplay of many texts.
Okay, so let us begin our discussion of part 2 of the essay Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. As far as this part is concerned, we can say that broadly speaking, this part deals with the distinction between parody and pastiche. The opening lines of this section of the essay, which basically deals with 3 or 4 things. One, as because continuing with his endeavor to enumerate the characteristic features of postmodernism, and in his attempt to describe postmodern culture, Fredric Jameson now deals with one, in this section, parody and pastiche. Parody as one of the defining features of high modernism and modernism, and pastiche as one of the defining features of postmodern art, postmodern culture, and postmodern architecture. Somewhere in the context of his discussion on parody and pastiche, the writer also tries to deal with the ideas related to past and history. How the notions of past history have undergone a change before he finally goes on to introduce or to explain in a greater detail the notion of simulacrum as it applies on postmodern art, on postmodern culture. The disappearance, in the very opening lines, we find this term pastiche. The disappearance of the individual subject, along with its formal consequence, the increasing unavailability of the personal style, engender the well-nigh universal practice today of what may be called pastiche. What he means is that pastiche is a form which today has gained a lot of acceptance as far as creative and cultural expression is concerned. He names a few modernists who indulged in the use of parody in times prior to the inception of postmodernism. Parody found a fertile area in the idiosyncrasies of the moderns and their inimitable styles. So he mentions Faulkner, he also mentions W.H. Lawrence, to say that these writers regularly indulged in the use of parody. And as students of literature, parody is not something alien to our minds, because we have read so many parodies. And we know that a parody basically is a kind of a copy that is logically linked with the original. It arouses a sense of amusement in us. And parody is a method where some earlier works or some earlier writers are remembered, their works, their methods are imitated, to not to make fun of them, but they are used in a general sense to arouse humor. We have all seen how Alexander Pope makes a very discreet use of the epic form, okay, to in the writing of his Rape of the Lock, and how he parodies the epic form in the Rape of the Lock. So parody has given place, has been substituted by, has been replaced by a new method, and this is called pastiche. Pastiche has a direct relationship with intertextuality, because pastiche can be defined as a fusion of a variety of different, logically unrelated styles. It can also be described as a free interplay of texts, or simply as intertextuality. Pastiche is a method in which intertextuality is intertextuality comes into play. Now, let us see how pastiche is described here in this essay. But before that, I would just like to read a couple of very significant statements. The explosion of modern literature into a host of distinct private styles and mannerisms has been followed by a linguistic fragmentation of social life itself, to the point where the norm itself is eclipsed. And then he goes on to make some statements about certain changes that have taken place in the collective consciousness, whereas in the earlier times, okay, bourgeois ideology was dominant. In the new cultural realities, bourgeois consciousness, bourgeois ideology has also been replaced by a different kind of a world, which we'll try to understand as we move ahead. But coming back to our point, what is pastiche for Jameson? So, pastiche is like parody the imitation of a peculiar or unique idiosyncratic style. This is how he defines. So pastiche is derived from parody, but it is different from parody in the sense that pastiche is more like mimicry. It is mimicry. Okay? It does not have, it is characterized by an absence of an ulterior motive and devoid of laughter, of any conviction. So it is, we can say, parody is an imitation, pastiche is an imitation. But whereas parody, first of all, is logically connected with the original. Here, there is no logical connection with one original. Secondly, there is a free borrowing, and later on he will use the term cannibalization. There is a borrowing, there is a cannibalization of not one, but so many different texts. One is reminded of contemporary Punjabi, fusion music, popular Punjabi fusion music today, which borrows from here, there, everywhere. You have a mixture of, you have a fusion of so many different things, of folk, Punjabi folk, of various kinds of Western forms. So pastiche is thus blank parody, a statue with blind eyeballs. It is to parody what that other interesting and historically original modern thing, the practice of kind of black irony and so on and so forth. Then, this is what I was referring to. He uses the term cannibalization, but not in the context of creative arts and literature, but in the context of architectural. It's same kind of pastiche is to be witnessed in the field of architecture also. Whereas in high modernism, the personal style of the masters redefined architecture. But today, this situation evidently determines what the architecture historians call historicism, namely the random cannibalization of all styles of the past. The play of random stylistic illusion and it is at the least compatible with addiction, with the whole historically original consumer's appetite for a world transformed into sheer images of itself. So here, the second term. I told you that this section deals with 2 or 3 things. One is the distinction between parody and pastiche. And second, that this is a society where art can be described as using Plato's term for an imperfect copy, simulacra or simulacrum. So it is for such objects that we may reserve Plato's conception of simulacrum. And what is simulacrum? The identical copy for which no original ever existed. Appropriately enough, the culture of the simulacrum comes to life in a society where exchange value has been generalized to a point at which the very memory of use value is effaced. So, and then he uses another very important term which all the students must try to understand, that the image has become the final form of commodity reification. So, three things: that art can be equated with simulacra. Simulacra is a text which does not try to copy anything, or which does not try to relate to anything outside it in a realistic sense. And it does not, or it defies all notions of perfection that may have existed through the ages. So it's unconventional, non-conformist, and very, very unorthodox kind of an art, where there is a jumbling up of so many different texts. And mind you, this you can see all around you. You can, in your advertisements, in our advertisements. I'm reminded of an advertisement. I think I've talked about it in the class also. That advertisement can fit into our description of postmodernism so well. There is this guy eating a bar of chocolate, and there is an old lady whose sticks falls down, and she requests this guy to pick up that stick. And what is amusing about this is that the guy never pretends to be inattentive. To every request of that old lady, he says, "Okay, Maji." But he does not pick up her stick to help her. And then, through a bizarre coincidence, a building right above the head of that old lady falls down. And during that time, the old lady is trying to pick up her stick, and her life is saved. So here you see a mixture of so many different things. You have irony, you have comedy, you have seriousness, you have you have an invocation, invoking all those values which we believe in, and then a subversion of that value, that we should help the elderly. It is our duty to help those people who are physically in need of help. So that kind of a thing. So there is an inversion, there is subversion, there is jumbling up of texts. This has become the norm, and here you see the evidence of what is being described: simulacra, copy of a copy, world of surfaces. The next section deals with the ideas related to time, history, and the past, and how they have undergone a change in postmodern culture. The new spatial logic of the simulacrum can now be expected to have a momentous effect on what used to be historical time. So, in earlier times, the concept of time was understood as a linear concept with a beginning, middle, and an end. It was linked with what Lukács has defined as the genealogy of the bourgeois, or the teleological view that life progresses towards a definite goal, that the past, present, and future have an organic relationship. So this genealogy collapses. And I forgot to say that he links all this with what he has said, that it is a time when exchange value supersedes use value. Okay, when production is not determined by demand and supply, it is not determined by the balance of demand and supply. Supply supersedes demand. Similarly, as exchange value, the price of a thing, supersedes use value, the use of it. So this is consumerism. The fact that you want a thing is not determined by your needs. Rather, it is determined by other factors. So this is what he means when he says that exchange value outstrips the use value. The past is thereby itself modified. What was once in the historical novel, as Lukács defines it, the organic genealogy of the bourgeois collective project, has meanwhile itself become a vast collection of images, a multitudinous photographic simulacrum. And past itself is nothing but texts, and more texts. Past is also a simulacrum. This he tries to prove through a very lengthy discussion where he mentions a very important movie by George Lucas, American Graffiti. This movie came out in 1973, but it was set in the 1960s and tried to recapture the rock and roll era. His main point here is that past is the past is understood as not as any qualitative change between then and now, but simply as fashion change. And nostalgia films are a very good example of this. I remember a Hindi nostalgia film which was recently released, starring Shah Rukh Khan and many other stars of our times. It was called Om Shanti, and which is less of a parody and more of a pastiche, where they try to reenact a past era. However, rather than any serious engagement with the past, with how time has changed and how life has changed and how we have become better or worse, rather than asking these questions, past is revisited to study the fashions. This is one of, he mentioned so many nostalgia films in the next part, primarily to suggest this kind of a new we can say understanding of history, time, past, present, their relationship. Hanji. So I was saying that in this section, there is a continuation of some ideas which were discussed in the earlier section with reference to E.L. Doctorow's ragtime,
George Lucas's American Graffiti, okay, and the notions of parody and pastiche. Here, in this section, which begins with the term, the crisis of historicity, Jameson's take the same argument forward, and he explores certain new ideas related to what he has described as the waning of historicity. In simple terms, waning of historicity simply means that the notion of time has now become less important and the notion of space has become more important. Temporality has been replaced by spatiality. Okay, in the earlier periods of human history, people tried to understand life, to make sense of life through the notion of temporality, that in life, past, present, and future, they form a cohesive and a very meaningful whole. Okay. Now, the notion of temporality has almost become an impossibility because of the fragmentations that have entered human life. Okay. These things have, you can link it with what we have said during the last lectures, but because of the changing nature of life, because of the changes that have taken place in the postmodern times after the expansion and rise of late capitalism, temporality has been replaced by spatiality. And this is what he describes as the waning of historicity. Okay? The historical consciousness seems to have not disappeared, but it seems to have become very, very attenuated and very irrelevant and very weak. Okay, so this is what he means by the crisis of historicity. Okay, the crisis in historicity now dictates a return in a new way to the question of temporal organization in general in the postmodern force field, and indeed to the problem of the form that time, temporality, and the syntagmatic will be able to take in a culture increasingly dominated by space and spatial logic. So we can also put it, because he has used this term syntagmatic. Okay? We can also relate it with the view that now synchrony has taken the place of diachronic. Okay? A diachronic view is a historical view, where you look at the present in terms of what happened in the past and what will happen in the future. Whereas synchrony or a synchronic view is a view where you look at life only in terms of what is happening at the present. So diachrony has been replaced by synchrony and the syntagmatic systems. Okay. Subject has lost its capacity actively to extend and so on and so forth. Okay, so we can sum this up, this very complicated sentence. We can summarize it. We can in a nutshell say the same thing in a much simplified form by saying that the subject has lost its ability to organize its present and future into a coherent experience. Okay. And to borrow a term used by Jameson in the opening of this section, cultural experiences heaps of fragments of heterogeneous, fragmentary, and aleatory. Okay. Aleatory is something that depends upon chance. So the cultural experience is heaps of fragments, constitutes heaps of fragments of heterogeneous, unrelated, fragmentary, and aleatory aspects. Then he focuses on two terms as far as the rest of this section is concerned. The two terms are textuality and schizophrenia. Okay? Textuality and schizophrenia. He cites 2-3 works in order to prove his point. One of the works is Margaret. I'll just read it out for you. Margaret Sackey's autobiography of a schizophrenic. This is related to one of the two terms I have just mentioned, textuality and schizophrenia. So he links postmodern experience with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is, in simple terms, is a kind of madness, okay, which is characterized by a split in the person's personality. Okay? A person assuming different identities at different times and not possessing a single, unified personality as a subject. So he links the postmodern experience with schizophrenia, and schizophrenia can be defined in clinical terms, it can be defined in Freudian terms, it can be defined in several other ways. He chooses the Lacanian model based on the theory of Jacques Lacan, okay, to describe schizophrenia. Okay? And there are some significant differences between Freudian model of psychoanalysis and the Lacanian model of psychoanalysis, because whereas for Freud, the unconscious, okay, we referred to Freud when in the last lecture when we used Jameson's term return of the repressed, where he said that the past today, okay, is not there as something which is logically connected with the present, but past presents itself as if something that was repressed is resurfacing without our conscious awareness of it. So whereas for Freud, the unconscious is a phenomena which exists in its own right. Okay? For Lacan, the symbolic order, okay, which gets its life through language, which comes into existence through language, constitutes the consciousness or even the unconscious. So for Lacan, whereas for Freud, this is not the case. For Lacan, the symbolic order or the language, okay, constitutes everything, including the consciousness of human beings. So everything comes into existence through language. Man becomes conscious of his identity, of the identity of others, not through certain inherent faculties that he is born with. Rather, he becomes conscious of his identity or the identity of others, and he starts to make sense of the world once he enters the symbolic order of the language. So that is how we can understand Lacanian psychoanalysis in its very, very basic features. So Very briefly, Lacan describes schizophrenia as a breakdown in the signifying chain. Okay? So Lacan describes schizophrenia as a condition in which the subject, okay, experiences a breakdown in the signifying chain. Okay? A normal person, okay, in a normal person, the signifying chain, okay, is very much present. You know, this signifier is related with the other signifier. This signifier, okay, the globe, okay, refers to a ball, which refers to the earth, okay, and that is how you then finally arrive at the signified, the earth, the world, and one signifier is connected with the other signifier, and they help you to arrive at various concepts. So, for Lacan, schizophrenia is a breakdown of the signifying chain, the interlocking syntagmatic series of signifiers which constitutes an utterance or meaning. So, or in Lacan, Oedipal complex is not something that can exist outside language, outside the function of the father, as explained through language. His conception of the signifying chain essentially presupposes one of the basic principles, okay, of Saussurean structuralism, namely the proposition that meaning is not one-to-one relationship between signifier and signified, between the materiality of language, between a word or a name or its referent and concept. Meaning on the new view is generated by the movement from signifier to signifier. Okay, and when this chain breaks down, one enters the condition of schizophrenia. So this is the condition that, to put it very simply, when the chain of signifiers experiences a rupture, we can describe it as the postmodern condition. When the relationship breaks down, when the links of the signifying chain snap, then we have schizophrenia in the form of a rubble of distinct and unrelated signifiers. So now let us take a break and remind ourselves that Jameson does not seem to be taking an entirely negative view, because it may, it may appear to one that he is using this term schizophrenia in order to say something negative about postmodernism. That does not appear to be the case, because he looks at both the positive and the negative side. Now, the break, whereas your involvement in the signifying chain, your adherence to the signifying chain, makes you a normative human being who is bound by the normal ways of looking at the world. A break in the signifying chain also liberates you and helps you look at things in a new way, because nothing in this world, nothing is transcendental. Nothing has come from the heavens. We are far removed from the Platonic ideas that everything is basically, everything that exists in this world is an imitation, is a copy, is derived from some abstractions and ideas existing in the cosmic world. Now, in these paradigms, the everything is constituted in this world through language. And what he calls schizophrenia also gives you the liberty to break away from conservative. And postmodernism actually is about non-conformism, about freedom. So he has, and ends on the other hand, when you lose a sense of history, you probably are unable to look at life as a whole. You are in a state of euphoria, living in the present, because synchrony is living in the present in a state of euphoria without having a sense of history. How has the world changed? Or has it remained unchanged? Have we been able to solve the problems? Have we been able to deal with the problems which plagued human life collectively? In fact, collectivity itself becomes impossible, because schizophrenia also is a condition that isolates the subject. Now, a schizophrenic will never be able to look at himself as a part and parcel of the humanity. He or she will look at himself or herself as in terms of his or her own life, the idiosyncrasies of his or her own life. So there is both the negative side, there is both the positive side, and Frederick Jameson is a Western Marxist. He and Western Marxists have a very peculiar position, because you must have paid attention to the introductory lectures. There I have tried to list some features of Western Marxism and how it is different from classical Marxism. There is a paragraph from Margaret Sackheys, who was a Swiss psychoanalyst, and this passage, I remember very well the day it happened. We were staying in the country. So this is the account of a schizophrenic, a girl, from the perspective of a psychoanalyst. And this is a book. This has been taken from a book called Autobiography of a Schizophrenic Girl. So he uses this as an example to show us how schizophrenia enables, or I should say even empowers you to look at the world from a fresh perspective, which a normal human being is incapable of doing. So here we have a little girl. I remember very well the day it happened. We were staying in the country. I had gone for a walk alone. I did not know. Then suddenly, as I was passing the school, I heard a German song. And then she says she does not look at the school as any normal child would. Rather, it seemed to me that I no longer recognized the school. It had become as large as a barracks. The singing children were prisoners, compelled to sing. It was as though the school and the children's song were set apart from the rest of the world. And then she says, I returned to reality. Now, reality is here a constituted reality, a reality which which assumes its form through language. And when you come out of that system of language, system of signifiers and signifiers. You look at the artificiality of that reality. And this girl looks at the school as a prison. So the succeeding remarks are very, very important, and you can link it with what we were discussing right now. In our present context, the experience suggests the following. First, the breakdown of temporality suddenly releases the present of time from all the activities and intentionalities that might focus it and make it a space of praxis. Thereby isolated, the present suddenly engulfs the subject with an indescribable vividness, a materiality of perception, properly overwhelming, which effectively dramatizes the power of the material. And then he goes on to say, this present of the world of materials becomes before the subject with heightened intensity. So three things are happening. One, that the present is foregrounded. Past and the future are obscured. One. Then the present ceases to be a space of praxis. By space of praxis, we mean a space of possibilities of intervention. Possibilities which, I should say, generate a desire to collectively change life that is occluded, that but present gets foregrounded. There is a heightened intensity in the present. And last, this present of the world on material comes before the subject heightened intensity, bearing a mysterious charge of affect, here described in the negative terms of anxiety and loss of reality, which one could just as well imagine in the positive terms of euphoria, a hallucinogenic intensity. So on the one hand, reality seems to be slipping away, and on the other, you experience euphoria. After that, he takes another example. This is a poem by Bob Perelman, who's an American poet who experimented with language writing. Language writing is a model of writing where poetry is not considered to be expressive or a medium of expression. So it was a highly experimental form. The poem is titled China, and this poem is followed by some comments by Jameson, once again, on the negative and the positive sides of this condition of schizophrenia. And thereafter, he takes another small extract from Flaubert. I will just read one or two lines from the ending of this section. I would like to characterize the postmodernist experience of form with what will seem, I hope, a paradoxical slogan, namely the proposition that difference relates. Our own recent criticism, I'll skip a few lines. Yes, the former work of art, in other words, has now turned out to be a text whose reading proceeds by differentiation rather by unification. So this was